Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be here.
Today, we're diving into LBJ.
Lyndon Baines Johnson,
Yeah, one of those figures in American history that kind of leaves you scratching your head.
a bundle of contradictions.
Yeah, how did the same guy who championed civil rights and pushed through this massive social agenda also get us so stuck in Vietnam?
It's a puzzle.
Yeah, big time. And to try to untangle it, we're turning to an episode of American History Hit featuring the historian Mark Atwood Lawrence.
Great choice.
Yeah, now right off the bat, they highlight something about LBJ that I think is super key to understanding him.
Oh, what's that?
His time in Congress.
Yeah, before he was even a glimmer in the Oval Office's eye, he'd already spent 24 years on Capitol Hill.
Wow, 12 in the House and 12 in the Senate.
Exactly. He basically became this master strategist of how to make things happen in that world.
So it wasn't just him riding the wave of public opinion or anything?
No, he was already a skilled architect of policy, even way back then.
That's fascinating. And I guess that's extra impressive considering they point out how different Congress was back then.
Oh, yeah, the parties themselves were more ideologically diverse.
Oh, right. So much more coalition building and compromise needed.
Exactly, and that's where LBJ really shined. He had this uncanny ability to bring people together.
So this Johnson treatment we hear about,
Oh, well,
it wasn't just him bullying people into submission?
no, not exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, picture yourself as a senator, right?
Huh?
And LBJ needs your vote for some bill he's passionate about.
I can only
He'd
imagine.
zero in on, you make you feel like the most important person in the room,
With a term.
buckets of it, but also this intense presence, you know?
Like you couldn't say no.
People felt compelled to agree. It's like he had this aura of persuasion.
Wow. So strategy mixed with this almost overpowering force of personality.
That's LBJ in a nutshell.
No wonder he got so much done. But it's interesting, the podcast also makes it clear that this drive wasn't just about power.
Not at all. He had a deep-seated belief in the power of government to do good.
He was a huge FDR admirer, right?
Absolutely idolized him.
So he really bought into that New Deal idea of using the federal government to uplift everyday Americans.
Wholeheartedly. And that's something that's kind of striking when you compare it to the way many people view government today.
Oh, yeah, it's almost like a different political universe.
Right. Much less trust in government's ability to solve problems.
But LBJ, he was all in on that idea, and then he becomes president.
And things get really interesting.
The podcast does a great job of laying out his Great Society agenda, and it's just this whirlwind of social programs and reforms.
An ambitious vision.
It's almost hard to grasp just how much got done in such a short period.
It was a unique moment in American history.
But they make the point that it wasn't just LBJ's force of will that made it happen.
Oh, no. He inherited this really particular set of circumstances.
Like what?
Well, for one, the economy was booming.
Okay, so the country was in a good place financially.
Right. And then there was the national mood after JFK's assassination.
Oh, yeah, this profound sense of loss, but also a yearning for unity and progress.
Exactly. It was like this fertile ground for LBJ's seeds of change.
So right man at the right time with the right skills.
It all came together.
And when you look at the sheer volume of impactful legislation that passed during that time, it's mind-boggling.
It's a stark contrast to the gridlock we often see in politics today.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Medicare and Medicaid funding for education, the arts.
It just goes on and on.
A truly transformative period.
These weren't just bills, they reshaped American life.
And for the better, in many ways, the poverty rate dropped significantly. Access to education and healthcare expanded.
It was a real shift in how people experienced opportunity.
Exactly.
But then, of course, there's Vietnam looming over all of this.
Right. The shadow that ultimately defined his presidency.
The podcast talks about how LBJ campaigned on not escalating the war, but then did exactly that.
It's one of the great contradictions of his time in office.
So why the switch?
Well, you have to remember, he inherited a war that was already underway.
Right, this wasn't something he started.
Exactly. And the prevailing foreign policy thinking at the time was dominated by the domino theory.
The idea that if one country fell to communism, others would follow.
Precisely. And with the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union in full swing, LBJ couldn't afford to appear weak.
So was it all about external pressure, or did his own beliefs play a role?
I think it was a mix of both.
Yeah.
You know, he genuinely believed that a stronger military presence was the only way to stop the spread of communism.
And maybe even win the war outright.
Right. And in 1965, after winning re-election by a landslide, He really felt emboldened to confront Vietnam head on.
But as we know, that strategy backfired in ways no one could have predicted.
And that's where the Korea parallel the podcast highlights becomes so important.
Right, because policymakers were trying to apply lessons from Korea to Vietnam.
But the contexts were completely different.
In Korea, the U.S. fought a limited war to avoid provoking China.
Exactly. Whereas in Vietnam, LBJ and his advisors thought they could achieve total victory without sparking a wider conflict.
A miscalculation with devastating consequences.
And all of this is happening as television becomes more and more widespread.
Right. For the first time, Americans are seeing the brutality of war unflinchingly right in their living rooms.
And that had a profound impact on public opinion.
Absolutely. TV brought the horrors of Vietnam into American homes in a way never seen before.
The casualties, the suffering, the growing sense of futility, it all chipped away at public support.
And LBJ, the master persuader, was losing control of the narrative.
It would ultimately contribute to his downfall.
Wow. So even with all his political savvy, he couldn't win over the hearts and minds of the American people.
Not in the face of such a devastating conflict.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly skilled politician facing mounting challenges in Vietnam.
And it's only going to get more complicated from here.
But before we dive deeper into how Vietnam unravels LBJ's presidency, let's take a closer look at the team he surrounded himself with.
Those best and brightest minds.
Because that's where things get really interesting.
I can't wait to hear more.
Me too. Okay, so we left off with LBJ, surrounded by all these brilliant advisors, these best and brightest, as they were called.
A real brain trust.
Yeah, but the podcast suggests that maybe all that brain power wasn't such a good thing in this case.
Well, it's fascinating, right? You've got these incredibly intelligent people analyzing data, strategizing, but somehow they lose touch with the human element of the conflict.
It's like they were so focused on winning the theoretical game that they missed what was actually happening on the ground.
Exactly. They were obsessed with statistics and models, but they overlooked the complexities of Vietnamese society, the determination of the Viet Cong.
The human cost.
Right. And that detachment wasn't just limited to Vietnam.
Oh, really?
It speaks to a larger disconnect that seemed to plague LBJ's presidency. This inability to truly connect with the American public on an emotional level.
And that's where the comparison to JFK really comes into play, right?
Absolutely.
The podcast mentions how different their communication styles were.
It's a stark contrast. JFK had this effortless charm, this charisma that just radiated through the TV screen.
He could inspire with his words.
Exactly. Whereas LBJ, despite being so persuasive in person, often came across as stiff and uninspiring on television.
So even with all his political savvy, he couldn't win over the hearts and minds of the American people, especially as the war dragged on.
It's a crucial point.
And then 1968 hits.
Oh boy.
The Tet Offensive, economic troubles brewing, and challenges from within his own party.
Talk about a perfect storm.
It's like everything's coming apart at the seams.
1968 was a turning point not just for LBJ, but for America as a whole.
So let's break it down, starting with the Tet Offensive.
Okay.
The podcast mentions it as this major turning point, but they don't go into too much detail.
Yeah, so basically it was this massive coordinated attack by the Viet Cong across South Vietnam.
Targeting cities and even the U.S. Embassy.
Exactly. And while they were eventually repelled, it demonstrated that the Viet Cong were far from defeated.
And it really shook American confidence, right?
Absolutely. It shattered this illusion that victory was just around the corner.
So even though it was a military defeat for the Viet Cong, it was a psychological victory.
Exactly. It fueled anti-war sentiment back home and made people question whether the war was winnable at all.
And as if that wasn't enough, LBJ is also facing challenges from within his own party.
Right. Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy both entered the race for the Democratic nomination.
Wow, imagine that the master politician facing a revolt within his own ranks.
It was a sign that he was losing his grip on power.
And all of this must have taken an incredible toll on him personally.
You can only imagine the stress.
The podcast mentioned his declining health, the heavy smoking.
He's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders.
So on March 31st, 1968, he delivers that famous speech announcing he won't seek re-election.
A truly historic moment.
It's almost Shakespearean, the tragic hero brought down by his own ambitions.
There's definitely a sense of tragedy there, but also perhaps a hint of relief.
Like he knew he couldn't keep going.
Right, for his own sake and for the sake of the nation.
But as the podcast points out, LBJ's story doesn't end there.
No, his legacy has been reassessed over the years.
Especially as Vietnam fades from memory and we face new challenges that echo those of his era.
There's a renewed interest in LBJ and what his presidency can teach us.
So what do you think accounts for this renewed interest?
Well, I think as time passes, we're able to look at historical figures with more objectivity,
Mm.
separate the person from the events.
And in LBJ's case, his domestic achievements, those Great Society programs, they've had a lasting positive impact.
An impact that we can appreciate more fully now.
It's like we're finally seeing the full picture, the complexities of his character, and the legacy he left behind.
And as we grapple with issues like income inequality, healthcare access, racial justice issues that LBJ tackled head on.
His story takes on a renewed relevance.
Absolutely.
So where does that leave us today?
I think it's an open question.
Is there anything we can learn from LBJ's triumphs and failures, especially as we face similar challenges in the 21st century?
That's what we need to figure out.
Yeah, it's almost like we're having this conversation with LBJ, like what would he make of our world today?
Right. I mean, one thing that jumps out at me is that LBJ operated in this era where people really believed in the power of government to make things better.
Yeah, like even with all the political fighting, there was this underlying faith that government could be the solution.
Exactly. And you look at the scope of the Great Society programs, they were ambitious, they were sweeping. It was a time when people thought big.
And it worked. I mean, you can't deny the impact of those programs.
No, you can't. But was that just a product of the times, a booming economy, a different political climate?
Is that kind of progress even imaginable in our current world?
It's tempting to just say things were different back then and call it a day.
Right.
But I think there's more to it than that. Yes, LBJ benefited from certain circumstances, but he also created opportunities. He was a master of the legislative process. He knew how to push and bargain and compromise.
And those are skills that are valuable in any era.
Exactly. It's about leadership. It's about vision.
So are you saying we need a little bit of that LBJ spirit today?
Maybe a little bit of that boldness, that willingness to use the tools of government to tackle big problems.
Even if it gets messy.
Even if it's imperfect. Look, I'm not saying we should ignore LBJ's flaws.
Of course not.
Vietnam hangs heavy over any assessment of his presidency.
Absolutely.
But I think his story challenges us to ask some tough questions about what we're willing to fight for here at home.
Like, what kind of bold vision do we have for our own society?
What are our priorities?
It's easy to get caught up in the negativity, the gridlock.
Right.
But LBJ's story reminds us that progress is possible.
It takes effort strategy.
And maybe a little bit of that Johnson treatment persuasion.
Maybe just a touch.
But more importantly, it takes a willingness to learn from the past.
LBJ's successes and failures offer valuable lessons.
About the potential and the pitfalls of government action.
Right.
It's a reminder that good intentions can have unintended consequences.
And that the pursuit of progress has to be balanced with a deep understanding of the human cost.
Yeah, that's such a crucial point. It's not just about passing laws.
Yeah.
It's about the impact those laws have on real people's lives.
And it's about listening to dissenting voices.
Being willing to change course when necessary.
Absolutely.
And admitting when you've made a mistake.
Those are all essential qualities of leadership.
Well, I think we've uncovered some important insights into LBJ's complex legacy.
A man driven by ambition, but also by a desire to make a difference.
He wasn't perfect. He made his share of mistakes.
But he also achieved some remarkable things.
Things that continue to shape our world today.
And in many ways, his story feels more relevant now than ever.
As we grapple with our own set of challenges, inequality, climate change, political polarization,
We're forced to confront those same fundamental questions.
what is the role of government? How do we create a more just and equitable society? Are we willing to do what it takes to make it happen?
Big questions.
Yeah, questions worth thinking about long after this deep dive is over.
I hope our listeners will continue to explore these issues.
And maybe as you delve deeper into LBJ's story, you'll find your own answers, your own insights into this fascinating and often contradictory figure.
It's a journey worth taking.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the past.
It's been a pleasure.
And keep those questions alive as you navigate the present.
Until next time.